FIDONET technical committee handed me the fossil document, and I decided to do the mailings. And
Right.
you know, before that, I never realized there were so many bulletin boards out there that existed with the intent of hoping that they might have an interest of incorporating in a FIDONET interface.
Right.
And to this day, I'm not sure how many
Well, there were several.
talked into it, but I've gone back on the internet and looked, and I know there were quite a few that, you know, some did it right away, and some did it a year later, and some, I forgot the most popular bulletin board at the time before FIDO. And I forgot that guy was is either Washington D.C. or on the East Coast, and but he just didn't want anything to do with FIDONET. And then all of a sudden, all his users started asking him to incorporate it. And the next thing I know, he called me up.
I'm recording, by the way. What do you call it? You know.
Oh, the tape is running now?
Yeah. But like I said, it's not.
My glass is going to present any kind of a glare problem?
No, you look fine. I've checked that. You look great. You know, in terms of, like I said, in terms of what I ask about, you know, for instance, I will eventually ask about the events in this living room, but also, I mean, one of the things that, and this is my impression of it looking back, because I had to look at it historically. I knew of FIDONET. I tried to run one in '86. I gave it up. So my knowledge was vague. But, you know, what I've read from the stories was that, you know, and talking to Tom, was that, you know, he decides to write his own bulletin board because of several things, and he ends up meeting John Medill because John Medill has a deck rainbow, and he wanted to work with the deck rainbow.
But John was in Baltimore.
Right.
At the time.
And and so he started to work on, you know, he starts to make this, you know, work on driver level stuff, and he's making the programming for it, for FIDO, and he's still, you know, he's hammering away at it even before it can become network. And then finally,
initially,
yeah, and then finally, you know, in like later '84, he starts coming up with the idea of, like, you know, having it be able to transfer messages, but it's a star pattern.
it wasn't late in '84. It was like May.
Was it? Okay. And he, the node numbers are being given out by hand, based on who sends in for them.
Oh, it was worse than that. I mean, people would call him, and he'd write down on a scrap of paper and stick it up on the wall, so it would remind him.
Post-its. I visited him at his home once,
Yeah, I did.
and his wall was a mass of Post-its. How he ever found anything in what was on the wall, I don't know. But a lot of them just fell off the wall and were lost forever behind the computer, as I said in that document.
Right, as he and I think another person explained to me, you know, there were gaps in the node numbers because they were people who got assigned node numbers and never picked them up, and all that stuff. And I guess there was a limitation on the number of nodes.
250.
The original?
In
6 or 5, way back then?
No, it was 7.
7, okay.
I think that was maybe 6.
But the interesting thing, in your history, you said you got it, and there was 2 releases later before you finally put your board up. It went like 4 to 7 or 4 to 6.
The first one I got up was version 5.
Yeah. All right.
And version 6 was the first one with a mailer.
Right.
Yeah, he works on that.
Version 7 implemented routing.
Right.
Yeah, one thing that really does strike me with Tom's particular work on this is that he goes through so many iterations of his code, unlike any other person. I mean, TBBS releases about once a year, even at its peak. And Tom is not only releasing version numbers, but version numbers with letter modifiers, so that, and he describes it as, in some cases, ground-up rewrites for many times, and doing these things. So it's this...
His approach was every time he changed the major version number, he had to completely redo the docs. That was his philosophy. So he resisted changing because he didn't want to have to do the docs again. And that's why we would go through subversion A through almost Z before he'd finally get around to upgrading to the next level.
My somewhat occasionally error description is me trying to help you remember some of the core of events. Ultimately, there's the meeting here. That's the big change that makes FidoNet go from being a really neat project that's exciting people to being a functioning entity that can survive and ends up surviving for many years because of it. What brought you...
In this very room.
And either one of you or both can answer this, but I mean, what got your attention with FidoNet? With Fido and FidoNet?
Let me take a swing at that from my point of view first. At McDonnell Douglas, we had just formed a computer club. New hobby clubs were difficult to get started because of all the red tape you had to go through. And finally, the guy that was really pushing for it said, look, let's have an organizational meeting. And if we turn out more than whatever number you say we got to have, we'll form a club, otherwise we'll forget the whole thing. They said, okay, you need 30. So we had our organizational meeting in the cafeteria at Mac Auto, and about 300 people turned up for the organizational meeting. So we had, not only did we have a club, it was already too big to manage. So we split it into special interest groups. Most of the special interest groups were oriented toward hardware. But there was a small group of us that ran CPM machines. And there was onesies and twosies of the hardware, but we all had the same operating system. So ours was the only special interest group that was oriented around an operating system rather than hardware. And the SIG authorized me to purchase a copy of CBBS from Ward Christensen. I don't remember how much it cost. It wasn't much. $35, $50, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I got in touch with him, and he sent me the sources on floppy disk, as I recall. I'm not sure.
That's all we had back then.
And I put them on my Cromemco machine and sorted through them and got familiar with the code, modified a few things, and got it actually running on my Cromemco machine. And we were going to put it up on somebody's machine on this side so that we could have a bulletin board for the users in our SIG. I lived over in Illinois, so I wasn't going to ultimately operate the thing. Well, the president of the club got wind of the fact that we were putting up a bulletin board, and he came and talked to me. I told him, yeah, we already have the software. It runs on CPM-based machines. He says, well, I've obtained a commitment from DEC for an indefinite loan of a Rainbow 100, which is kind of a hybrid machine. It has an 8086, excuse me, and it has a Z80, and it runs DOS on the 8086 side and CPM on the Z80 side, and you can boot it up either way. I said, fine. And so we got organized and got a room a closet actually assigned. Started negotiating to get a phone number. And then I finally got the docs from the deck folks. Well, it turns out they partitioned the I.O. in such a way that the Z80 did all the disk I.O. And the 8086 did all the character I.O. So CPM would have to run on the Z80 side because it was CPM code. I said CPM, I meant CBBS. It was CPM code. It had to run on the Z80 side, but it had to have full access to the modem port because BIOS was hopelessly inadequate to run a modem. There was no way that the Z80 could control a modem. So I'm in a panic, and I went scuttling around. I heard about a bulletin board system in Washington that was running under DOS. And so I logged into that board and left them a message asking them if they knew anyone that had a version of his software or any other that ran under on a Rainbow. And he said he had a friend in Baltimore he thought was putting up a Rainbow board. And he told me to log into his board. That was John Medill. So I logged into John's board and left a message asking him if he had software for the Rainbow. I got a response from a fellow named Tom Jennings, who I found out later was in San Francisco, not Baltimore. And he said he was doing a bulletin board system to run on the Rainbow, but he needed somebody to write a driver for it. Well, I didn't have enough information to write the driver, and I don't know where he went. He finally found somebody to produce a driver.
I know where
but
I know who wrote the
ultimately, he came up with software for a Rainbow. And he sent me a copy of it on diskette. The club paid him his $50, I think. And went down and installed it on the machine. It appeared to run, but we still didn't have a phone line. We cobbled in a telephone just to do some testing. Actually verified that it did run. And we left it sitting there in its closet, gathering dust for the better part of a month before we finally got a telephone line in there. And originally he said I was going to be FIDO number 9. When I finally went online, I became FIDO number 10. And that was in March or April, as I recall. And just about...
A moment, sir. See how you look there?
You want to change the...
I'm starting the camera again. The tape is so cheap, it works with me.
Do you want to go back to where we were? And
Not to go into. It would be because I don't want to hurt someone else's feelings or
Right.
something like that.
Right. And that's...
yeah,
Not because I don't necessarily want to keep it a secret.
with the name dropping.
Yeah.
I mean, there were enough names in FIDO.net, but not.
For a long time, when I was trying to explain to people why I wanted to do a documentary that included a lot on FIDO.net, I said it was because it was almost like the politics were built into the code.
Oh yeah.
You were up in Minneapolis?
Yes, I just was.
Okay. Did you see Randy Vanderlip?
No, I did not.
He's up there.
I
He's
know.
living in Minneapolis.
Unfortunately, no. There's a lot of, okay, let me pause this for a minute.
Yeah.
I'm not interested, and I'm in the middle of a TV interview right now, and I can't talk.
Carl Schenke and Tom Henderson would both have a lot to say about him, and so would
Yeah, Carl Schenke should be on your list.
Absolutely.
Where is he?
He's in New Jersey, northern New Jersey.
And who's the one that runs the big net out of New Jersey now?
I don't know.
You talking about the host up there?
It again, but yeah. So I mean, there are going to be people I'm missing, but I've gotten quite a few, so I'm somewhere in the middle. But one of the things that I did want to talk about was the process that led to having a meeting in this living room.
Oh, that's a year downstream yet.
Ben was talking about how he got involved.
Okay.
And then,
it's your
I
turn
don't
to-
know whether he was finished, but I assume the next thing you were going to do is ask me how I went through that same process.
Sure.
I would be interested in hearing that too, Ken. Yeah. I don't think I've ever heard the story before.
No, I get it.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. At the time, I was working for a library automation vendor called Data Research Associates, and we were a DEC authorized distributor. And I, once upon a time, was a DECie, worked for DEC, and was at that point in time employed by DRA. Was very active in the DEC local users group, and we wanted to set up a bulletin board system at DRA for the local users group, and we started looking around for bulletin board systems that were out there, and it's probably right after McDonnell Douglas started doing their looking. One of the guys, in fact, it was the president of our company, discovered the Fido. He downloaded it. DEC donated a Rainbow to us, and U.S. Robotics donated a 1200 baud modem. So basically, that's how I got involved. We wanted a BBS for the users group, and wasn't shortly, I guess right around the same time, Tony Clark, who is
Tony
the third,
Clark was ahead of us. He
was the head of the IBM local users group.
He was Fido number 4.
Right. So, you had McDonnell Douglas, you had Digital Equipment Corporation, and you had IBM, and, we had, I guess, 4 BBSs right, in our company, and I guess altogether we had about 7 of them in St. Louis, so we became an ideal test ground to put all the pieces together and make sure everything worked, but that's how I got started.
Now, it seems that Fido's ability to run the DEC Rainbow was a real. The fact that it could run on a number of platforms that weren't as one of the interesting things that came out of talking with Tom was Tom talked about how that even though there's this kind of a back hit, the people look back and they think, oh, the IBM PC came out and the PC compatibles came out and then that was it. That in fact there were major compatibility problems between them, the different companies. In fact, they were against compatibility on that level.
I think if you read one of those historical documents that Tom wrote, it took him 2 weeks to write the Fido_DEC. I mean, he had a horrible time putting it together.
Well, that was one of the reasons I ended up getting involved, was because of the compatibility issue. Henderson knew that I was building a PC that was more IBM compatible than IBM's, and wanted that knowledge of how to make them compatible so that he could get CDOG to be able to not have the same problem.
Right, that came up. That came later on when we were trying to distribute the node list.
The problem we're talking about is the
Original.
IBM.
The original problem.
Yeah.
Right?
IBM went open systems on everything but their BIOS. And that was so that a lot of hardware manufacturers could get on board and make plug-in cards for the machines. I don't think they were quite prepared for all of the compatibles that started coming out. But Phoenix Software, for whom Jennings worked at one time,
Right.
developed.
And I was an OEM for it.
They developed a BIOS using what do they call it? It's not a Greek wall.
Chinese wall.
Chinese wall. Using a Chinese wall. They put a bunch of engineers who knew software, but didn't know the PC, didn't know anything about the PC. They gave them specs for a BIOS, and they said, write something that meets these specs. And they did. And because of that, IBM could not claim plagiarism. And they marketed the damn thing, and suddenly everybody and his brother is making IBM compatibles.
Well, the DEC Rainbow was actually more IBM compatible than the IBM compatible that
Not
was
true
sold
at all.
at the beginning.
Not true at all.
It ran more software.
At the software level, yes.
Yeah.
At BIOS level. But DEC chose to go closed system. They did not want to release the specs on their system. They did it very grudgingly. And it was only because they were dealing with a corporation considerably bigger than they were that we were able to get some of the specs. We never did get a complete set. But we got enough to know that we couldn't do what we wanted to do with DEC Rainbow. But, they had weird things. They had a 360 kilobyte single-sided diskette, which is totally incompatible with IBM. You can't even exchange disks between IBM and Rainbow.
That's correct.
But that's beside the point. That has nothing to do with Fido.
Well, I mean, but it's important for me to know because, I mean, that's what I've gotten from the others was that what brings people together is not so much let's all run a BBS, but, you know, let's get this software that can run on these different incompatible platforms and just do it once.
That wasn't really that important until... Oh, it's an interesting story. Tom and I used to talk on the phone frequently because Mac was paying my phone bill. So it was an easy thing for me to call him almost every day. It was difficult for me to remember that they're 2 hours behind us out there in San Francisco, so if I get in the morning at 8 or 8:30 and call him right away, I'm shaking him out of bed at 6:30. So I usually waited till about 10 before I called him. But I was talking with him one day, and he said, you know, I was talking to John. One ringy-dingy. He said, I was talking to John Medill and got to thinking about it. He says, wouldn't it be neat if our boards could call each other up and exchange messages, or maybe exchange files? I said, yeah, you got an instant update delivery system there. And he said, well, it's kind of a neat idea. It's been bouncing around the back of my head. I came to work the next day, and usually I went down the first thing, down to the closet where the Fido was to check messages. And Tom Jennings had logged in during the middle of the night somewhere along the way. And he'd uploaded a new Fido, another program called Fido Net, and a node list, and instructions on how to put it all together. And suddenly we had systems that could call each other up and talk to one another. And that's when the community of compatible systems or similar systems became important, because now we had a lot of boards that wanted to talk to one another. And prior to that, it was just a neat, interesting exercise. One of the first changes that I recall that he made, this was even before FidoNet. He says, "I got a great new feature." He says, "I've got broadcast mail." Well, it wasn't really broadcast mail. You could enter a message and label it broadcast, and what Fido would do is on the next mail period, he'd start down the node list and call every number he had time for, and once he got done, that was it. Or at least that's the way it was supposed to be. Well, for the message he was sending out, that was it, because it was marked sent. The boards that received the message, however, never bothered to clear the broadcast bit. And that was the first bit Fido checked in the message. So if you received a broadcast message today, you're going to send it out tomorrow. So the second day we had tons of messages bouncing around the net, and by the third day we were swamped. So very quickly he had to fix that. But that was fun. Your turn. I'm going to drink some coffee for a while.
I'm trying to figure out where we go from here.
Honestly, wherever you want to go. I mean,
we had just introduced FidoNet. It was just about this time. I'm not sure exactly how it happened, whether TJ gave Ken my phone number, or whether he gave me his phone number. But it was just about this time that we got in touch with one another. And of course the node list came out shortly thereafter, and we could see one another and started exchanging mail messages. But it was a lot of fun.
Well, that first year when I was maintaining the node list, that was a nightmare. You know, because, this is pre-multi-net FidoNet, and it was still the single node list and the single network. And the way the instructions were, you call FIDO51. Well, FIDO51 was at Data Research, and essentially they were calling everybody, was sending me a email in order to get their node number. And they had to have mail running. And the way Jennings would tell people, he says, if you want to go down for a weekend, call FIDO51, call Ken Kaplan. Or if, you have a problem, or if you accidentally, list your voice number in there, call Ken Kaplan. So the increase, 1 week would go by and the node list would get bigger, and the next week would go by and the node list would get bigger.
And the changes came in.
Yeah. And while this was going on, Jennings was upgrading FidoNet and making changes and revisions, and all of it was handled manually. I had an editor, and I go in and I, enter in the name of the board and the phone number and the baud rate and the city and the state, and I think Ben and I set it up so we had to have everything by Wednesday night, so by Thursday morning, we could publish it. And at that point, we weren't publishing anything. All we were doing is putting it on the board. And Jennings put a note in there, come to Fido 1, or Fido 2, which was Medill, or Fido 10, which is McDonnell Douglas, or Fido 22, which is my board at home, or Fido 51, and you could get the node list. So those were, the boards in St. Louis were the most active, busiest in the whole country. And this was back in the neophyte days.
Before we even took over the node list, when Jennings was running it, somebody'd call him up with a change, and he'd write it down on a post-up, and he'd stick it up on the wall. And maybe he'd see it in a week or so and finally get it edited into the node list, and maybe it'd fall off the wall and he'd never see it at all. And after we went network, I don't think it was a month, maybe a month and a half. And the node list was such a shambles that you didn't know whether you were going to get an answer when you called a node or not. So Ken and I got together over the phone, and I said, we've got to do something about this. And I said, I've been talking to TJ, and he's reluctant to give up the node list publication. And I said, well, why don't we gang up on him? So I made a conference call with Ken, and once again, I had somebody else paying the bills, with Ken and TJ. And we managed to beat him soundly about the head and shoulders over the phone. And finally he says, okay. Now, what our position was, you've got to give up this chore and let somebody else do it. So he says, okay, you do it. And I kind of shuddered and I said, Ken? And Ken says, all right, I'll do it. That's the way that went. So Ken had been doing the node list, and it wasn't all that bad when we were 30 nodes. But by the end of the year, well, and actually into the fall, we were getting up 50, 60, 70 nodes. He was getting new node numbers, 2 or 3 in a week, plus changes to 10 or 12 nodes in a week. And trying to verify that everything was correct and the numbers were right and everything became a real challenge. And finally, he gave me a call one day. He says, Ben, he says, can you write me a program that'll test the sanity of the node list? And I said, yeah, I could probably come up with something. What do you want to look for? And so we discussed the various kinds of problems that people habitually put in, putting fields in the wrong order, putting the wrong kind of data in, and putting spaces in when they're not supposed to be there, and all that nonsense. And we made a collection of various things that the program is supposed to look for, and I wrote the software that would look for it, all numerics and phone number position, or unpublished, whichever. That was the only other thing that was allowed in that position. And I wrote him a program. I've forgotten what I called it even now.
ListGen. Was that ListGen?
Yeah, that was ListGen.
Yeah. ListGen.
And
Version 1.
that was superseded by MakeNL. That the node list continued to grow, and by late winter, early spring of '85 now, we'd been in business as a network almost a year. And that's when TJ laid the awful truth on us. program FidoNet, which he had it organized as two programs. Fido was the bulletin board, and then it looked for the occurrence of the mail time, and it would terminate and activate FidoNet, which would come up and do the mail thing, and then it would terminate and reactivate Fido. Well, FidoNet carried the node list in memory while it was running. He'd read it from disk and do some processing on it, but then he had it in memory. And he was a firm believer in creating .com programs. A .com program, everything has to run in a 64K image, both program and data. So he didn't have that much space for data. He had 250 node limit. Well, we were about 230 nodes at that time, active nodes on the node list. And so we started getting panicky. Meanwhile, McDonald, I'm trying to figure out a way to get TJ here so we could have a conference and talk face to face. Well, I got a call from our Mac Computer Club president. He says, "You got any ideas for speakers?" He says, after a year, I'm running out of ideas. I said, "Well, you know, our bulletin board system's written by a fellow named Tom Jennings. I'm sure he'd be willing to come talk to us." And so the club says, "Well, that'd be a great idea. Where'd he have to come from?" I said, "San Francisco." I said, "Well, I don't know if we can budget that much." So I talked to Ken, and he got DECUS interested.
Yeah, DECUS shared responsibilities.
DECUS and the Mac Club went halvesies and bought TJ a plane ticket. I think he stayed here, didn't he?
He stayed at my house.
So they didn't have to buy him a hotel, but got him a plane ticket. And he came out and he spoke to a joint meeting of the Computer Club and DECUS at Mac Auto.
Right.
In the cafeteria. And it was an interesting presentation. It wasn't great, but it was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And that occurred on a Wednesday. And the next day, I took off work, Ken took off work, Tony Clark took off work, and TJ, we all came here. And this is the meeting you're talking about.
Did we have any other people from out of town that came in for that meeting? I know John Wickman was here.
They were here. I don't think there were any out-of-towners that attended in person, but Tom Henderson attended by phone.
Right.
And that's when we started talking about what are we going to do. We're running out of node list space. The node list is becoming unmanageable. It's so big anyway. And I'm not sure. Well, let me back up. It was summertime, middle summertime, I'm not sure, of '84. I suggested to Tom that because of the phone chargers involved, it might be prudent to gather as many messages together on a local call basis and then bundle them together and send them off to a given source and then distribute them, or given destination, and then distribute them from there, which meant Fido had to be able to route messages. Well, TJ didn't really understand routing all that much, but he said, you tell me exactly what it's got to do, and I'll make it do it. So I started devising a routing language which his program would then decode to create the routing. And the reason we wound up doing it, at the time we started doing this, we were about 30 nodes in the net. 6 of those nodes were here in St. Louis. And so we could simulate a network right here in St. Louis with 2 hosts and 2 other nodes other than the hosts, and we could shuffle messages back and forth all on local calls. So we wound up doing the testing. Nobody else had the routing until we had it working. And at that time, we'd try something, find out it didn't work, go back to TJ, needs a little massaging here, and some of it was problems in the routing language, some of it was problems in the software, and the way development runs. So we tested the better part of a month, off and on, just our 6 nodes. Tony Clark and I communicated by phone, and the other 4 all worked in the same office, so they could communicate across their desks. So communication for the testing portion wasn't that tough. And once we had something working, then TJ released version 7, announced it to the world, and we had Fido that could route. So now we had people playing with routing, and how do you tell the rest of the world that you're doing routing? I don't know who came up with the idea. It might have been Tom Henderson, that we could put the routing information into the node list. And then Fido could pick that off from the node list and figure out what routing information it needs to run a particular node. And we worked that way from, August or September of '84.
Until May of '85.
June.
Or the meeting, we were here maybe.
Well, the meeting took place in May,
Yeah.
but we were continued to operate in that mode until we had everything in place. But that's how we got to the meeting. Now we're back at the meeting, but we needed to know about the routing because they implied the network host subordinate node simply from the routing structure. And so we talked with TJ, and he said, yeah, he could code that into Fido and create an implied routing that wouldn't have to be stated. Network host, you're sending a message to a node in that net, you send it to his host. And we worked out all of the details for how all this was going to magically work. And then Tony Clark says, wait a minute. He says, we got these 20 or 30 nodes out here that aren't close to anybody, scattered around the country. What are we going to do with them? And so I said, well, we could simply plunk them into somebody's network. He says, yeah, but then the host is responsible for distributing mail to them at long distance rates. And I don't know who suggested the region concept, but initially it was just a dodge so that we could have hosts that didn't route. And what we did, TJ had some maps in his knapsack, and he pulled out a map of the U.S. All it had was the outlines of the states. A huge map. It was bigger than this coffee table laid out on the floor. And Tony Clark and I got down there with felt tip markers and started carving out regions.
We used either I used to work for the telephone companies, so I don't remember whether we used the basketball conferences or I had pulled some information out of the white pages, but they very nicely had the whole country divided up into sections. And we had to break it up. I think we break it up into 8 or 7?
10. There were 10 regions.
10. In the United States or further?
One of them was Hawaii, Jakarta.
That's why, yeah.
There were 9 on continent, and I'm not sure where we put Alaska. I think we put Alaska in region 10 with Hawaii and Jakarta.
We had somebody in
but it was totally arbitrary, really. What we were trying to do was come up with more or less equal populations as best we could guess. Just looking at a map with nothing on it but state boundary lines and 2-letter symbols indicating what state they were.
Yeah, Tom thinks it was the basketball.
It was possibly some of it was the NCAA, the college conferences at the time, and I couldn't tell you which division, but it was really a lifesaver because there were a lot of people out there that didn't, that were really, they wanted to do it their way. They didn't want to be a part of a network, and those people wound up initially being in a region and doing their own thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I mentioned to you before they came, Tom considers regions the greatest failure in FidoNet because they turned to solve the problem. They defined geopolitical boundaries, and there started to be levels of people thinking, well, there's a region coordinator, and that person, and that's his perception.
Yeah.
Most of his.
Well, Ben and I certainly didn't look at it that way.
Okay.
Because
initially that wasn't a problem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, the regional coordinator was nothing more than a super network host. It wasn't until
later on. Yeah.
God, yes, it was past Colorado Springs.
86.
Let's see. Colorado Springs was in 86, and it was past that we finally decided the thing was getting too large and wanted to distribute the management of the network hosts. That's when we put the networks under the regional hosts, and they become subordinate to the regional hosts. And it was only for management of the node list. That was the only reason for doing it.
And again, it was
but
to decentralize it off me. Because I was doing it all. At the beginning, I was doing absolutely everything. And every time these guys came up with something, it was to get it off me and get somebody else.
That's when you asked me to make the sanity program. When we converted over to the net node scheme, the network hosts took over the management of their own node lists. And they would put together their node list and send it to Kent.
Right, in segments.
And they would be littered with errors. That's when he asked me to write the list NL. It wasn't earlier.
Well,
it was...
Well, there was also something very interesting that happened in all that. There were some people that didn't want their telephone number published. So we came up with the idea, well, you gotta tell your network host what your phone number is. We don't care what it is, but your network host
he's got to have it so he can forward.
So he can forward mail. So prior to that, I mean, there were people sending in node list requests with no phone numbers. They request a net node, they tell us what city state, they tell us the name of their board, they tell us their baud rate, and everything else, and no phone number.
They can't get a node number because the only way to get a node number is by return FidoNet mail. Without a phone number, you can't return the mail.
Do you remember the reaction on the part of the Fidos when, you basically are saying to them, we were English, but now we're going to be metric, and the reaction.
Going to the net node.
Yeah.
Actually, that was very well received, I think, and in fact, it was so well received that we were all prepared for a horrendous horror story when we switched from the amorphous net to the net node concept, because we all did it on the same day. We're supposed to. And then try sending mail. I figured, it's going to be a catastrophe.
Also,
mail went like crazy the next night.
Yeah.
no problems at all.
Yeah. We also educated everybody. Fido News was already a weekly document, and we kept telling people, we can't keep going on like this. These are our problems. This is what we're doing about it.
Plus, we put a lot of information in the node list because there were a lot of people who didn't read Fido News.
That's true.
That's right. Fido News had a way of talking to you at the beginning, didn't it?
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
The node list right at the beginning had quite a bit of text information, which was strictly comments. Fido ignored it.
Right. With the addition of the node list, I got the impression that by the time the new format comes out, there's a lot more, there are nodes backing up, getting ready to come on. And that after
we put a freeze on the node list. In fact, we did it the day we were here. We said, okay, we're not going to accept any new nodes until we've got software out there that can support it. And the first upgrade was capable of running either way, a single amorphous net number 0, or net node. And we got that distributed, and as soon as that was distributed, we started letting network hosts assign their own node numbers. But we gave them a group of node numbers and said it's got to be a number from this list, because as long as we're an amorphous net, we still have to have unique node numbers. And that worked pretty well. And the difficulty was a lot of the network hosts weren't terribly careful in the way they edited node lists. So everybody was sending their node lists to Ken, and he was getting a hodgepodge. And that's when ListGen came out. And Ken was the only one that ran that program.
Say what you want, considering this was a hobbyist group and there were amateurs involved, we did an incredible job of putting out this segment, this node list segment, every single Friday. And between Friday and Friday, and I know Ben will back me up, we had some absolute catastrophes. There were times when FidoNet wouldn't handle the node list. There were times when Ben's software wouldn't handle the node list. There were times when I didn't have enough memory to process it.
That was another thing that ListGen did.
Yeah.
It compressed, it didn't compress the node list. It analyzed the node list and distributed only the changes, the differences between last week's node list and this week's node list, because the node list was getting awfully big by that time.
So that's the heart of the node diff.
Yeah. I wrote the software to do that.
You know, when things, okay, by 85, or mid-85, Tom Henderson's running Phyto News by that point, I believe. He's taken it up from Tom.
Yeah, that was another thing that Tom
He
started.
took over Phyto News about January of '85.
Right, so you see, he's taken over Phyto News. You've essentially got the node list. He's working on the node list as well. I mean, you know.
And I'm writing the software that does the node list.
He's supporting me, and I'm doing the processing. And in the meantime, Henderson is the one that really wound up bailing us all out because he wrote, he wanted something to send out Phyto News. So that was when, that gets back to this send list thing, or what do you call it? Sendmail. That's when Sendmail started. He wanted something to send out Phyto News, and I'm saying, God, let this run on the rainbow so I can send out the node list automatically. And that's what started it all.
Yeah, the one theme that's going to probably come out of two of my two segments in my documentary is that to this day, Tom Henderson is perceived by a very large group of people as an evil, destructive person, and yet all the research shows this is quite the opposite.
Yeah.
That in many cases it's simply misunderstandings or bad PR.
Absolutely.
Let me tell you how that happened. We're going to get out of order again.
Getting out of order, that's for my editing.
Tom had a dark mustache, and at the time, a beard similar to yours. Black hair. Sharp features in the face. And just to glance at him, he looked kind of evil. Also, people on the net didn't know him that well. Yes, he was publishing Phyto News, and he'd written some articles that were a little opinionated. But people on the net didn't know him all that well, and we got to Colorado Springs. And that's when the IFNA thing blew up. We're going to have to come back to that.
Yeah, I'm down to 4 minutes on this tape, so I don't want to start that on a 4 minute.
Yeah, that's not going to... You get a little bit more than 4 minutes.
Since I'm strangling to death, this might be a good time to take
Break?
a break, and I
Okay.
can get rid of some of the coffee I drank, and maybe dash out for a quick smoke.
That's fine. I mean, we could do that, or we could stop and eat, or we could call, someplace and bring it in. I mean, it's up to you.
We typically eat very late, so Nora and I are fine as long as the restaurant stays open.
There's no problems here with restaurants staying
Okay.
open.
It's not like Illinois.
No, it's not like Illinois.
Okay, so we'll do that. I don't know if we can.
Have we done 2 hours already? Good. Heavens.
For 30 seconds.
That's a problem. Yeah, I mean it's a.
What do you want? We're breaking.
I need to find the little boy's room.
What do you need?
Is this it?
It must have something in there.
Oh boy. It's a sound disaster, but what can you do? Now, I'm not, before Ken, strongly indicated he wanted you here, I hadn't heard of your name, probably because I'm so attached to a certain, 5 or 10, because I'm doing so many different subjects. But, after he mentioned it and I looked up your name, I started to see a lot more. Once you start to look for it, it's one of those.
Yeah, I was there.
I always tell people, give me a name and I'll work with the name, because sometimes I just don't get those names. That's how I missed Randy Bush. I went through the West Coast and then I was like, oh yeah.
Well, so you were probably looking for Rugen instead of Old Frog. If you looked at Old Frog early on,
That's true.
Somebody said, somebody said, go look for Old Frog, and then you were all set. But anyway, the main reason I'm interviewing Ben and Ken at the moment together is simply because I wanted their opinion on creating the node list, node list part, and I was interested in. Also, I wanted Ken's response to the big thing at the Phyto conference in, I believe it was Virginia, where Tom broke because it's always stated that, Ken tried to rescue things and was unsuccessful. So his name is always affiliated with it that way. But I don't know. I don't know if you missed the whole thing where I was talking about it. I'm just trying to get everything I can, and
Sure.
it's great to have this many.
Who is this for?
Me, and for creating a documentary.
Well, I understand that. You're sponsored by anybody? Or
Nope.
All right.
You're
Just a guy.
being silly about it.
A guy who saw a hole and went out and bought an awful lot
You
of
guys
concrete.
don't care.
I do care. What?
Oh, okay. No, I think we're going to get some pizzas and bring them in,
Okay.
and then we can keep right on rolling. And
Okay. And in terms of, in terms of the sound, I don't know what we can. I can. It works in the